Look at a reconstructed skull of a Neanderthal side by side with your own face in a mirror. The Neanderthal skull has a heavy, jutting brow ridge, a long, low braincase, and a robust, forward-projecting jaw built for serious bite force. Your skull, by comparison, has almost none of that. A flatter face tucked in beneath a rounder, higher forehead, smaller teeth, a brow ridge reduced to barely a suggestion of one. For a long time, the assumption was simple. Modern humans were just the more evolved, more refined version, an upgrade in every direction, a straight line of progress from brutish and heavy-featured to sleek and modern. But there's a stranger explanation sitting underneath that difference, one that has nothing to do with refinement and everything to do with a very specific biological process usually reserved for barnyard animals. Start with what that process actually looks like because it wasn't discovered by studying humans at all. It came out of an experiment involving foxes. Beginning in the mid-20th century, a research institute in Siberia began a breeding program with one deliberately narrow goal. Take wild silver foxes and, generation after generation, breed only the calmest, least aggressive individuals with each other, selecting purely for tameness and nothing else. Each generation, researchers tested how the foxes responded to a human approaching the cage, reaching a hand toward them, or simply standing nearby, and only the most relaxed, least fearful individuals were chosen as breeding stock for the next litter. No one was trying to change how the foxes looked. Physical appearance wasn't part of the selection criteria at all. And yet, within a startlingly small number of generations, something strange started happening to the foxes' bodies. Ears that should have stood upright began flopping over like a puppy's. Tails that should have been straight started curling. Patches of white, piebald fur appeared on coats that had been uniformly colored for thousands of generations in the wild. Faces became shorter and rounder, more youthful looking, retaining juvenile proportions well into adulthood instead of growing into the sharper, more angular face of a typical adult fox. Some of the tamest foxes even began wagging their tails and whimpering for attention when a person approached, behavior essentially indistinguishable from a friendly domestic dog, despite having wild fox ancestors only a few decades removed. None of those traits had been selected for directly. Researchers were breeding for calm temperament alone, and an entire suite of unrelated physical changes came along for the ride anyway, as if tameness and floppy ears, curly tails, and baby face features were somehow wired together at a deeper level than anyone had expected. That collection of traits now has a name across the animal kingdom: domestication syndrome. It shows up to varying degrees in nearly every species humans have ever domesticated: dogs compared to wolves, pigs compared to wild boar, cattle compared to their wild ancestors. Smaller brains relative to body size. More juvenile, baby-like facial proportions retained into adulthood. Reduced aggression. Patches of depigmented fur or skin. Changes to reproductive cycles. The pattern is consistent enough across completely unrelated species that biologists became convinced it couldn't be a coincidence and started looking for a single underlying mechanism that could explain why selecting for one trait, tameness, would drag along so many seemingly unrelated physical changes automatically. The leading explanation researchers converged on involves a group of embryonic cells called neural crest cells. Early in development, these cells migrate outward from a narrow strip along the developing spine to build an unusually wide range of unrelated structures throughout the body. Pigment cells in skin and fur, cartilage and bone in the face and jaw, part of the adrenal system responsible for the body's stress and fear response, and even portions of the teeth and skull. It's an unusually promiscuous set of building assignments for a single cell population to be responsible for, which is precisely what makes it such a compelling explanation for why so many seemingly unrelated traits keep showing up together. A single, relatively mild genetic tweak that slightly reduces how actively neural crest cells migrate or proliferate during early development could plausibly turn down the stress response, producing calmer, tamer animals, while simultaneously producing smaller jaws, patchy pigmentation, floppy ears, and more youthful facial proportions as an unavoidable side effect. since all of those structures trace back to the same population of migrating cells. One mechanism, one modest developmental adjustment, and an entire package of traits shows up together every time in fox, dog, pig, and cattle alike, without evolution needing to separately reinvent floppy ears or piebald coloring from scratch in every species. Now bring that mechanism back to the mirror. Comparative studies of skull shape across the human lineage have found that modern Homo sapien skulls consistently show a pattern of traits that lines up strikingly well with domestication syndrome, when placed side by side with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other extinct relatives. Smaller, less pronounced brow ridges. A shorter, more retracted face. A rounder braincase retaining more juvenile proportions into adulthood instead of growing into the longer, lower skull shape seen in archaic humans. Reduced sexual dimorphism, meaning less physical difference in build between males and females, another trait commonly seen in domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestors. Researchers examining skull collections spanning tens of thousands of years have also noted that this trend appears to have accelerated in the more recent portion of human history, with skulls becoming measurably more gracile and juvenile featured even within the time span of anatomically modern humans, well after Neanderthals and Denisovans had already disappeared, suggesting the process wasn't a one-time shift, but something that kept gradually intensifying. None of these are subtle, cherry-picked details. They form the same recognizable cluster researchers had already identified in foxes, dogs, and pigs, just showing up on a different species entirely. Genomic comparisons have added another layer to the case. When researchers compared the modern human genome against reconstructed Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, extracted from ancient DNA preserved in fossil remains, they found that a disproportionate number of genes showing evidence of recent, strong selection specifically in modern humans cluster around genes known to be involved in neural crest cell development and function. The exact same biological pathway implicated in the fox experiment and in domestication syndrome across other species. That overlap is difficult to explain as pure coincidence. It suggests something in our own evolutionary history selected, whether directly or as a side effect of selecting for something else, along the same underlying biological pathway that produces tameness and its associated physical package in every other domesticated species studied. The obvious next question is what modern humans could possibly have been selected for, given that there was no outside breeder choosing which humans got to reproduce. The leading hypothesis is that humans effectively domesticated themselves. In small prehistoric groups where cooperation, tolerance of strangers, and the ability to live peacefully within a larger, more socially complex community became increasingly valuable for survival. Individuals who were less reactively aggressive, easier to cooperate with, and more socially tolerant would have had a real reproductive advantage over individuals who weren't generation after generation, without any single external party doing the selecting. Highly aggressive individuals may have faced a more direct cost too. Some researchers studying small-scale societies have proposed that extreme reactive aggression within a tight-knit group would have carried serious social risk, from being excluded, exiled, or in extreme cases killed by the coordinated action of the rest of the group. A pressure that simply doesn't exist in the same form for a solitary predator with no group to answer to. The community itself became the selective pressure, favoring calmer, more cooperative members in much the same functional role a human breeder played for the Siberian foxes, just distributed across thousands of years and countless individual social interactions instead of a single research program. There's a comparison from the animal kingdom that makes this idea feel less speculative. Primatologists studying bonobos, a great ape species closely related to chimpanzees, have documented that bonobos show a similar cluster of traits relative to their more aggressive chimpanzee cousins. More juvenile facial proportions, reduced aggression, and greater social tolerance, despite no human ever having bred bonobos for those traits at all. Bonobo skulls, much like modern human skulls compared to Neanderthal skulls, are noticeably more gracile than chimpanzee skulls, with smaller brow ridges and more retracted faces. the same physical signature showing up independently in a completely different branch of the primate family tree. Researchers studying the split between the two species have proposed that bonobos essentially self-domesticated within their own environment, likely because their habitat, south of the Congo River, offered more abundant food and less direct competition than chimpanzee territory, reducing the evolutionary payoff for aggression and increasing the payoff for social tolerance, producing the same recognizable package of traits that shows up whenever an animal population gets selected, by any means, for reduced aggression. None of this means modern humans are somehow less capable, less intelligent, or less wild than our extinct relatives in any meaningful sense. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, made sophisticated tools, cared for injured members of their group, and clearly survived successfully in harsh environments for a very long time before eventually disappearing. What the comparison suggests instead is something narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. The particular shape of your face, the size of your brow ridge, even your own reduced physical aggression compared to a chimpanzee or an archaic human relative, may all trace back to the same handful of migrating embryonic cells that gave a Siberian fox floppy ears and a curly tail, just running on a version of the process that unfolded across thousands of generations of humans instead of a few. Decades of controlled breeding in a research facility. So the next time you catch your own reflection, the round forehead, the modest brow, the face that never quite grows into the heavy, robust proportions of your extinct relatives, consider that you might be looking at something closer to a domesticated version of an older, wilder human than a simple upgrade. Not tamed by anyone in particular, and not tamed all at once. Tamed gradually, face by face, generation by generation, by every ancestor who found it slightly easier to survive by getting along than by fighting.